So I know that there are some inherent issues when it comes to shell temper. And so what this does by agitating it like this over and over and over is, let's see if you can see in here, it puts all the big stuff to the top. Smooth. I said, I'm not worried about a beautiful pot. I'm looking for serviceable. All right, they're fully cool now. We're good to go. Listen to the ring on it, if you can hear it. Hey guys, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire. And on this channel, we typically do primitive build or hunting videos, kind of like this one. So if it's your first time to the channel, do please consider subscribing. Today's video is going to focus on primitive pottery. And that's only because next week's video is going to focus on primitive animal glues. And if you know anything about me and have been following my channel for really any amount of time, you know that I don't typically take the easy way out. We show you the way that it would have been done in early times. And most people today that would teach you how to make different types of animal glues would just put it in a metal pot, cook it on the stove, and call it done. And to truly be able to appreciate what it means to even have hide glue or sinew glue, you must have a working knowledge of how to create and use primitive pottery. So that's why we are focusing on the primitive pottery in this episode first. And before we get started, I do want to make mention that I do not consider myself a potter in the least. Primitive pottery, or pottery in general, is a topic not unlike any other primitive skill that you can immerse yourself into for a lifetime in order to become a master of it. And I personally do not spend the proper amount of time learning how to make really true good pottery. I make a handful of pots a year just for utilitarian purposes like this one, because I want to have a very basic working knowledge on pottery making. So if you have a lot of pottery questions, I'm really not the one to ask, because this is without a doubt not my area of expertise. And if you are somebody that is experienced in pottery, you are probably going to watch this video and see all kinds of things that you would love to say that I'm doing wrong. If you want to drop a note down in the comments with some suggestions, I'm all ears, because I'm always willing to learn more about something that isn't my area of expertise. But that being said, let's go ahead and put a couple pots together just so we can use them for next week's glue video. Okay, so I know that there are some inherent issues when it comes to shell temper for pottery, you know, shell blooming, or the calcium in it, like expanding. I don't know the proper terms for that. So these are scallop shells, and a lot of the temper in pottery that's found around here is smashed up shells. And whether it's scallop shells, I don't know. It's probably scallops and oysters and, you know, about any other type of shell, you know. So when you start looking at what's readily available at the shell mounds, it's stuff like scallops and oysters, especially oysters. So we have whole places around here, you know, there are different shell mounds, you know, and peoples are eating oysters and scallops, clams, and, you know, just all kinds of stuff, and discarding the shells everywhere. So this is a byproduct, and it's really easy to smash up. And whether it has problems down the line in the future for pottery, that may be so. But for my uses, using a pot for creating, you know, sinew or hide glue, or for making pine pitch, that kind of thing, this works perfectly fine. And the eastern clay, especially Florida clay, it's a lot different than the western clay as well, and you need quite a bit of temper, things to take up space, because the clay here, at least around where I live, it's not in great abundance, but what we do have, it shrinks a lot, so you have to actually use quite a bit of temper. Realistically, it's garbage clay is what it is, but you can still make stuff out of it. Okay, so that's enough kind of for now. I'll save some of those for later. We bashed up quite a bit. Okay, so now this is a pot that I made. This one actually doesn't have any temper in it at all, and I can't use it for much anything else because it's got this great big crack in it and it leaks water like crazy, but it'll hold stuff, you know. So would a wood bowl or just another big shell. And see, I don't bust it all up into this really fine powder yet. I get it close, you know, just kind of break the shell up. But if you sit here and just pound every little bit of it up, it'll drive you nuts, and I just don't think you're going to be able to do it. So what you can do is you can refine it by gathering it up and putting it in another vessel and then shake it like this. Actually, we probably have too much in here to really do that. I should probably back some of this off, at least for now. Should probably put that in another vessel altogether. But what we want to do is agitate it. And so what this does by agitating it like this over and over and over is, see if you can see in here, it puts all the big stuff to the top, and as you dig down, it stacks all the finer stuff down at the bottom. That's what we really want. So if you agitate it all up like this, not like crazy, like flopping it, mixing it, but just keep shaking it back and forth, you're going to get all the big stuff kind of floats to the top. So then you can come in and just go ahead and knock the big stuff off. And you don't have to get it all, because we're going to go back and do this several times over. It really does help to have another container. All right, so I went and got the coffee mug that my friend Casey at Modern Witch Doctor, she made that for me. So I'm going to use that for now, just because it was handy. I had it already on my desk. So I'm going to put that stuff back in here. And that's the stuff I haven't agitated yet. But this is primarily all big stuff that needs crushed down even more. So now I'll put this in here. Okay, and I'm going to agitate that again. We're getting a lot better off because we're starting to get a lot more powder in it overall. So okay, so that you can see all the big stuff here, and then the finer stuff is kind of in the back. So we'll separate it out, and like I said, we're going to go and do this a couple times, and we'll just continue the process. And so don't be in a rush to do it. It seems like it takes forever, but you can probably smash up quite a bit of shell, which creates a lot of temper, in about an hour. It really doesn't take that long. If you just say, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do it, within an hour you'll have some really fine temper bashed up. It seems like this would work really well, but it kind of doesn't. I mean, it probably does some, but in the grand scheme of things, take the widest, flattest section you have once it starts getting more like powder, and just keep hitting it with that. Now at this stage, instead of just accepting, you know, some bigger pieces, I'm going to go through and make sure I really powder everything up that I really can, within reason. And I mean, you're not going to get it to a complete powder per se, but you don't want big chunks in there either, because when you start making the pot, those are going to stick out the side. But you can already see quite a difference from when we started, you know, with that we're able to break it up. I'm sure you could get even more involved and get like a real mortar and pestle and kind of use that, but for me, a napping hammerstone and just a flat rock, that works just fine for me. So see how much nicer we're starting to really make that now? And it didn't take really any time. You know, it took just a couple minutes. And we're really knocking it down into a nice shell sand is what we're doing. And see, I don't want it as dusty. I don't want it like a powder. You know, I don't want, like that size right there, that's not a big deal if you can see that. That's not that big of a deal. I just don't want that great big stuff, kind of like that. Okay? Anything here that we're going to use, that's perfect right there. So just repeat that step over and over and over until you got the big stuff bashed up. Now, even all this being said, when we say, okay, shell may have some issues with the calcium in it popping or whatever, say, well, why don't you use pottery shards? Because that's a real possibility too, that we could take pottery that's already made, it's cracked, and basically break it up the same way. Number one, the shells are really thin, so they're really easy to break up. And the reason I'm really using this is because this was just readily available in Florida and it was used. So I just kind of want to use what's here, whether it makes the best pots or not. So I want to use it as well, and I want to get the data from it. All right, so we went through everything that we had and we're back. You can see how much finer it's getting. So we just do the same thing again. You can see immediately how the stuff raises to the top. And so that's the exact kind of stuff we'll pull right off the top. And we'll grind that again until we get it down to the size of the temper that we want. All right, gotta grab us a hunk of clay, you know, maybe a however big you kind of want it, a little bigger than a baseball, smaller than a softball, I don't know. I only pinch pot. I don't do the coil pots or anything. I'm not a potter. I think we've made that kind of clear. I'm just into the functionality of making a tool to make something else. So I got a little cup of water, and then I've got my temper here, all the shell temper, so I got that hanging out. So I'm gonna take my clay and I'm gonna make just kind of a rudimentary little bowl just like that. And I don't actually love the powder, you know, I just like that kind of that medium coarseness stuff. So I'll go ahead and shake that off into there. Not as much yet as I'm going to use. I don't really know, I just kind of run by eye. I'm, like I said, this isn't my thing, but I've made several, you know, actually I guess quite a few, you know, pots that work, but I don't specialize in this. So I kind of just fold that together and just kind of keep squishing it and kneading it together, and I don't really wedge it on a rock or anything. I just kind of do it with my hands and work it together. What I'm really kind of wanting is, I just want to see that temper in the same consistency in the clay as when I look at primitive pottery. And the cup of water obviously is for when you start adding the temper, you'll also start drying it out. Plus, the more you kind of work it, this clay is going to dry out. And the clay that we have here, in all honesty, is just not very good clay. The Western clay is just so much better overall. The Eastern clay, it cracks really, really easily. Like, even when you squeeze it like this, it's about impossible to coil out a piece and then bend it. It just doesn't work like that. But this stuff we have here, it just shrinks so bad. And just during the air drying process, it likes to crack. So it kind of helps to almost make it in a time that it's somewhat humid, and then store it in a humid place, you know, such as, you know, a underground rock shelter, you know, kind of thing, or summertime when it's super humid. Sometimes that's your best options for letting this, if you set it out in the sun, it's going to crack every time, just air drying. So I can squeeze it and it just starts kind of almost breaking apart. And I don't want a lot of water, because a little water goes a long way. I'll just pick it up on my hands and just kind of mix that in. Like I said, you can't really bend it. This stuff breaks and just tears apart. I've seen that really good clay that you can take this and almost bend it and it'll stay together, you know what I mean? So not everywhere's got awesome clay. Interestingly enough too, a lot of the people around here used moss, in like Spanish moss that hangs from the trees, and I've done that some. The problem is that it makes a serviceable bowl. You can use it, but the problem that I'm going to have in this situation is that when you use the moss in it, and I think the reason for that, from what I've gathered and when I've used it, is because it kind of binds it together a little bit, and then when you burn it, it burns the moss out of it. But because this clay shrinks so bad, that almost helps keep it from shrinking as much, if that makes sense. So I think there is definitely a method to that madness. But in this situation, I need a watertight vessel, and I've never personally been able to make a moss tempered, you know, like moss and shell or moss and sand or something like that. I've never been able to make a moss tempered pot that didn't weep water. And so I'm really going to try to make something that doesn't weep, because if there's cracks or holes and you're constantly losing water, it's also going to take the glue that we're going to try to make with this pot, and it's going to wash that out. I've made that mistake before by using a pot that weeps and then constantly boiling sinew in it all day, or hide or whatever, and then at the end of the day thinking I should have glue, and there's nothing but water, because you just keep filling it up. And yes, you do have to fill it with water as you go, because you have to add more as it kind of evaporates off. But if you end up just pouring all of the you know, keep pouring water in and all the glue just runs out of the pot, it can never collect in there, then you're not going to have any glue. So, you know, that's what really all this is for the next video that we do, where, you know, after we take this pot, we make it, we let it dry, and then we fire it in a pit. We're gonna take a lot of sinew scraps, either from the deer that we butchered with a stone knife in a previous video, and I can drop a link down in the description for that, or the scraps from a lot of the bison sinew that we have as well from that video. And so the idea here is I just need to have a watertight vessel to make animal glue out of. All right, once I've got enough temper in, I think it's really mixed up well. That's kind of how I wedge, is just in my hands. And the idea is I kind of want to be able to get the air bubbles out. I've never been really good at the idea of where they work it and they fold it over. That never made a lot of sense to me, because I feel like when you fold it over, you get air bubbles in it. But like I said, I'm not a pottery expert any stretch of the imagination. So it's like I kind of work it as far as I can one way before it gets too flat, and then I turn it and come back the other direction. And that's worked out for me pretty good. And then it gives my hands kind of a chance to dry out after I've, you know, got more water on it and everything else. But this, of course, helps to mix the temper in as well. But I want to make sure the temper's mixed in really well before I do it. And then I start doing it in smaller hits like this, where once I feel like the folds and the bubbles and anything like that might be out of it, what I really want to do is I turn it into a ball, about like that, which is pretty good. He said I only do pinch pots, so I'm going to wet my finger and my thumb back up, not sopping wet, but, and then I go ahead and I just start pushing my thumb right down in the middle, not all the way to the bottom. I just kind of start that process about like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk it around in one hand as I squeeze with this hand to start spreading it out. And then as I get a little, once it starts getting a little bit wider, I kind of squeeze and then I rotate a little bit at the same time, because then I can widen the lip of it a little bit. But I can squeeze it like this. If I just squeeze it the whole time, then I get a lot of finger impressions. So I start, you'll notice that I start kind of smearing a little bit. But I'll squeeze, and if I hit a spot that's a little bit too thick, then I kind of, you know, start wiping it like that. So I don't have a lot of technique instruction to really give you, but oddly enough, I'm right-handed. But once I get the initial hole done, I have no idea why, but I almost always switch to my left hand to use my left thumb. And I don't know if that would do anything to help you or not, but I feel like I control really well with my right hand. But this thumb, all I'm doing is wiping. And I don't want to just try to do it all at once, because then it cracks. You know what I mean? Like, it'll just split the clay. I guess the plasticity, if that's the right word, you know, that potters would use. It's not super bendy, you know, so we can kind of mess it up just by trying to squeeze it too fast into shape. So I'm constantly kind of smearing it with my thumb. I should show you what the inside looks like as I'm doing that. But you see how I'm not forcing it into shape. I'm just kind of wiping it as I go with my thumb. And then I'll pull my fingers a little bit too on this side. But for the most part, all I'm really trying to do is just manipulate this clay around. And I want to get that bottom about as consistent in thickness as possible. And I'll switch hands there a little bit, but it's probably about time I get back down there and start dipping my fingers in the water, smooth that up. But see how I just pinch pot this whole thing out? That's kind of my strategy. Okay, so once I start getting the depth that I'm looking for, and I'm getting the bottom smeared out to where it's starting to get a little bit thin, then I'll start working the sides a little bit more to start getting a a little bit more width. And it kind of doesn't matter to me if it's taller or wider. I don't really care. And I don't care a whole lot about, you know, styles and that kind of stuff. All I'm doing is manipulating the clay around to make a bowl. That's it at the end of the day. You'll also notice that around the top edge, as you start to manipulate this clay around, it's got a habit that it wants to start splitting a little bit. And before that ever gets bad, you'll notice it when that starts to happen. What I do is I get my finger down into some water and I wet it up and smooth it to fill all of that in before it ever gets big enough to create an air bubble. So I don't want to just cover it over. If it's got a crack in it already, I want to kind of push the clay into it to fill that gap because I don't want the air bubble. I have a feeling that these probably have more air bubbles than people realize, and they don't necessarily just explode. I actually don't have a lot of pots explode. I have them crack, but most of them crack during just the air drying process as opposed to the actual firing process. Once I make it to the firing process, I don't lose a lot. I lose one once in a while, and I know if I've got an air pocket or a water pocket or something going on, because it'll just potlit a spot completely out the side. But anyway, so what I'm kind of shooting for here is maybe thickness wise, if I had to take a guess, maybe 3/8 thick. I don't know. I could probably go thinner, and thicker might have some issues. I don't know. I don't know the answer to it, quite honestly. I just do what has worked for me in the past. And when I look at local ancient pottery, but you see how now I'm getting to that point where I kind of almost have to throw it around. This is just about as big of a pinch pot as I can realistically make. Probably make one a little bit bigger, but remember, you'll see these fingers working, but on the inside, my thumb is constantly working around. Whenever I start trying to reposition this, when it starts walking like this, you can see what I'm doing here, hopefully. When it starts doing that so much that I can't control it anymore, then I know that I'm getting about as thick as I'm going to be able to get. So I do have my grinding rock over there, and when I get close, I'm probably going to set that down. I don't overwork these things. I don't care about making them perfect. What I really want is I want it the size that I need. And this is going to shrink. This one, it looks a lot bigger, but when it's all said and done, it's going to shrink down to at least this size, at least, maybe even further. And I might be able to stretch it a little bit more to where it actually shrinks down and it's not even quite that small. But that's a good size. I can do hide glue or sinew or something in this size really, really efficiently. I can get quite a bit of glue out of that, as you'll see. So I'm going to make this one and another one just like this. And then we're going to let them air dry, and then we're going to fire them. But you can see I don't put a tremendous amount of time into this. 10-15 minutes to me, and I've got a pot that I can work with once I start the actual, you know, pot making process. So I just don't want to overthink it. Hold it in my hand. What I'm doing is I'm feeling for consistency between my palm underneath. A little bit of water. If it's got a much thicker bottom, it's going to dry inconsistently. Get that top smooth. I said I'm not worried about a beautiful pot. I'm looking for serviceable. That's what it all really comes down to for me. And for that, I'm going to take my finger and my thumb, and I want to run it around and look for inconsistencies where maybe I have a spot that's a little bit too thick. I got one around this back edge here at the bottom, so I'm going to thin that out just a little bit, and I'm going to thin it out by just giving pressure, squeezing and pulling. I don't care if this thing is perfectly round. I don't care if it's, you know, got some inconsistencies in the top of it. I said this is a bowl to use a few times, and I actually haven't had one break yet using it, even with the shell temper, but time will tell how that works itself out. So I think we got that just about where I want it. Wet my hands up, they're getting really dry. You either want them really dry or you want them kind of wet. Either way, so it doesn't stick to you. But the bottom's super flat, and I don't love a super flat bottom, because around that inside edge, that's kind of the problem that I have, is if it's a super flat bottom around the inside edge, I get cracks. And I don't know if that's my clay specifically that loves to do that, or if that's just clay in general. I don't really know. So I don't want that to be super flat, which is hard to do if you're setting it on a flat rock. But I'll set it gently. We can set it right on the ground too. That's not a big deal. All right, final adjustments, and that's pretty much it. As it dries, we can always come back to and smooth it up. Now, I will say I don't take it this extra step, but I do know this, that once you kind of get to where this stuff starts drying, you can take smooth stones and kind of grind and paddle and do all kinds of stuff to really smooth these things up. That's not my goal, okay? Like I said, if you want to watch folks that really are good at this, do that. I'm just teaching you how to make a serviceable pot. But now what we're gonna do is, realistically, this stuff cracks like crazy around here unless we give it ample time to air dry in really a damp location. So I'm gonna leave this thing alone for probably at least a week, and probably even more than that. Once it starts getting pretty hard, I can take it out and put it in the sun and start drying it out more. If I try to force dry this stuff by a fire, it's just gonna absolutely shrink down and completely blow up. So that's kind of a no-go around here. We have to give it a little bit more time. So that's what we're gonna do. We'll leave it in here where it's nice and damp, and it'll just dry really slowly as opposed to out in the sun. So in continuing to kind of experiment with this, I have a feeling that the one pot, the one on the left, is probably going to pop. I think there's probably air bubbles in that one. I think it was probably a little bit dry when I was kneading it together with the temper. And so the one on the right, I ended up going with a wetter consistency and then kneading it together and then letting it dry. But I do believe that the one here on the left, if I had to take a guess, that's one of the reasons I wanted to do two, because I wasn't 100% confident. I kind of wanted to try two different things. I would not be surprised if that one blew up, but that one should be okay. We'll test it out and see what happens. And of course, we're not just throwing them in right off the bat. We get them hotter and just kind of scoot them closer so they heat up kind of evenly. And these have been drying for quite a while too, so this isn't wet pottery. And once I feel like they're starting to get in there and get pretty hot, then I flip them over, and we'll fire them upside down when it's getting pretty close time. All right, so that left one actually pot lit on us right there, but that was kind of expected. I figured we'd have an issue with it, but we're gonna let it go because it didn't go all the way through. And honestly, I can just take the fired shards later and make a temper instead of using that shell and having to worry about the calcium bloom kind of stuff. But see, what I really did is I started taking, once I felt like I was getting it hot enough and I wasn't gonna shock it, that I could take some of the burned up pieces. They're not totally burned through, but they're good and white hot, and then I started spreading them around. So I kept easing them into the fire a little bit closer, and I don't think I rushed it too much because that one didn't pop. But I said, I'm not an expert. Maybe I could have gone slower, but it's been like 2 hours overall. I just keep shoving wood around and trying to get them hot. So that's where we're at. But so somebody can comment if they know more about it. And I know that there's an idea that you can take and put your pottery in the middle and build, you know, 4 corner fires around it to where you don't have to keep moving them in. But since I just have 2 pots to do right now, and really only one that I'm serious about, I figured this was just an easy enough way to make a fire, keep sliding it in, and then cover it over. So this is where I'm at now. I started surrounding it to make the heat more even. In probably another, I bet you 15-20 minutes, I'll start adding a little bit back here, and then once I'm really confident that it's super hot, I'm just going to start building fire up on top of it. All right, well, start shoving the fire up on top of it. Every now and then you lose one, but for the most part, I've done a couple dozen pots in my life, and this is how I do it, and it typically works out. If you got other suggestions, I'm always willing to listen, but I think we're good to go. Well, it's early the next morning, and I already came out and pulled some of the
ashes back away. You can see we still have red hot coals in here. I don't want to just pull these out of here because I don't want to thermo shock them, but they no longer need to be covered up. They don't need to cool down so much more. So we'll just take some of the insulation away. But then now's the chance too, like I've got a metal poker. That's the one that had pot lidded, and it actually has a pretty nice ring to it. But this one here, it's got a really high pitched ring. So I think we got a great firing on our good pot there. I'm excited to pull that one out when it's time, but we're gonna give that a while longer. All right, they're fully cool now. We're good to go. Listen to the ring on it, if you can hear it. It's pretty good. No cracks in it anywhere. That one turned out really well. And then this is the one that pot lidded, which I thought it would, and then oddly enough, it didn't even come apart. It was just a little thicker on that side. It popped it off. It actually sounds pretty good, but you can hear that it's got that damage in it. I probably wouldn't cook or anything out of that, but you could certainly use it for eating or drinking or something like that. But to do any sort of cooking stuff that we're going to do here in the future, we're going to use one that's clean like that. It's got a nice ping to it.
All right, guys, thanks for following along, and make sure again that you're following for next week, because that's when we are going to get into making the glue. And hopefully this just gave you a little bit of a taste of what primitive pottery is kind of all about. And it's actually, when you really dive deep into it, it's a lot more difficult than it really even looks in the video. All I've been able to do is take some things that have worked for me, repeat them over and over, and that's as deep as I get into it. But again, thanks for following along, and we'll definitely see you on next week's glue making adventure.